Okay, hello everybody. We're going to go ahead and start the webinar. My name is Mark Bollinger, and I'm with Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. And I'm joined today by my colleague and co-author Joachim Seal, whom you will hear from in just a few minutes. Before we get going, I just have one or two administrative notes to relay. First, everyone except for me and Yo will be muted throughout the call, which means that if you have any comments or questions, the best and really the only way to reach us will be to use the chat function that should be, I think, at the lower left of your screen. So just type your message into the box and hit send, and one of us should be able to see it and respond as needed. This is also how we'll be handling the Q&A portion of the webinar. So just type in your questions as they occur to you, and then once we're done with the presentation, we will do our best to get through as many of them as we can. Finally, I just want to note that this webinar is being recorded. So with all of that out of the way, we are here today to talk about the latest edition of our annual Utility Scale Solar Report Series, which was released earlier this morning. For those of you not familiar with this report, each year for the past 3 years now, we have gathered and analyzed increasing amounts of empirical data on the growing fleet of utility scale solar projects in the U.S. And we do this with the goal of identifying key trends in project characteristics, installed project costs, operating costs, capacity factors, and power purchase agreement or PPA prices. And so today we are simply going to run through each of these 6 topics in order, hitting on the highlights. So first, Yo will start out by describing the overall project universe, as well as a few technology trends or project design characteristics that we've found. Then he will run through our analysis of installed project prices and operation and maintenance or O&M costs. Afterwards, I will take back the microphone and describe how these projects have been performing in terms of capacity factors before moving on to PPA prices. And then finally at the end, I'll talk just a little bit about the future outlook for the sector. So before handing it off to Yo, I just want to draw your attention to the box at the bottom of this slide, which notes that in this report we define utility scale solar to include any ground-mounted solar project that's larger than 5 megawatts of AC capacity. So this includes not only PV or photovoltaic projects, but also CPV or concentrating photovoltaic, as well as CSP or concentrating solar thermal power projects as well. This definition may be or definitely is a little bit different than how some other organizations define utility scale. So we just want to be upfront about the universe of projects from which we're drawing data. Also, we do have a companion report series known as Tracking the Sun that focuses on smaller PV projects in the residential and commercial sectors with an emphasis on installed prices. So if you're interested in those sectors, you should definitely check that one out. So with that, let me turn it over to Yo to kick us off.
Thank you very much, Mark. It is my pleasure to co-present today on our new series, or the new edition of our Utility Scale Solar series. At first, I would like to introduce you a little bit to our project universe. In general, the statistics depicted here refer only to those utility-scale solar projects that have achieved a commercial operation date at the end of 2014. So we are not looking at projects that are currently under development or have been completed in 2015. We feel pretty good about the coverage of our project sample here. We have 192 PV projects, which clearly are the biggest chunk of our projects, representing 6.2 gigawatts. And I will talk a little bit more about the characteristics of these projects in the following slides. We also have 2 concentrating PV projects that were built in 2011 and 2012 that use the Amnex high concentration technology. They've been built in excellent solar resource areas and have an inverter loading ratio that is a little bit below the inverter loading ratio of PV, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a few slides. In addition to photovoltaics, we also have concentrated solar power or solar thermal projects. Many of them were built in the late 1980s or early 1990s, but really the biggest chunk of new capacity has been added just over the last years in 2013 to 2015, when 1.2 out of 1.7 or 1.8 gigawatts have been built. And those most recent installations use slightly different technologies. Previously, nearly all of them had the so-called solar trout technology. Now we've had one solar tower project that already achieved commercial operation and one that is currently in the last steps of optimization before commercial operation. In addition, a few of these projects also use on-site storage, solar thermal storage with molten salt technologies. This slide now represents the geographic location of the projects that we have in our data sample. We differentiate here not only project size, which is the size of the symbols, but also the underlying configuration, whether they use crystalline silicon or CSI modules or thin film modules, and the type of racking, whether it's a fixed tilt rack or a tracking rack. We see that in the Northeast we have primarily fixed tilt CSI projects historically, although there are a few sparse fixed thin film projects there as well. Whereas in the Southwest, where really most of our capacity is located, we have more tracking projects. And you see a few really big symbols over there. Those have been some recent very large projects that have been built. All of our solar thermal capacity is located as well in the Southwest, except one project that is in Florida. And as can be seen on the lower right, where we list the cumulative capacity share of the individual states, the Southwest really dominates. California has nearly 60% of all installed utility-scale solar, followed by Arizona with nearly 20%. And this fact makes it unfortunately a little bit difficult for us to really delve into state-level statistics in terms of individual loading ratio, prices, capacity factors, or PPAs. Just because outside of California, our data sample is really not allowing for that level of detail. This slide now shows the trend in different project configurations over time. We see that 2014 was a boom year for utility-scale solar that in general is dominating overall PV additions in the United States in comparison to residential and commercial additions, with nearly twice as much capacity installed in 2014 than in 2013. Traditionally, we have seen the lower two categories here in these stacks, namely crystalline silicon, dominating most of the market. That has changed now in 2014, where we really have a lot of new thin film additions. And nearly 50% of the overall PV capacity that was added came from just three very large fixed tilt thin film projects, namely Topaz, Desert Sunlight, and Agua Caliente. And I would like to spend a quick word here on how we index our projects. In contrast to some other organizations, we do not track projects by individual phase, but only index them once they've achieved their final commercial operation. And so that's why in 2014 we saw this enormous chunk coming online. And I think with that, I'll go over to the next slide, where I now return to the solar resources in the form of the annual global horizontal irradiance in kilowatt hours per square meter per day. The black solid line represents the capacity-weighted average irradiance of our total project sample that has been trending upwards slightly over the course of the years. Which basically just means that projects have been increasingly located, or most of the capacity of projects have been located in higher solar resource areas. In addition, we have here these little whiskers that represent the 20th and the 80th percentile of the project distribution. We see that tracking PV projects have a much narrower band, meaning that they are located in the desert Southwest primarily, whereas fixed tilt really spans the East Coast and the Northeast and the West. and so has a much wider distribution here. All else equal, the higher the global horizontal irradiance as a proxy for plane of array irradiance should boost the capacity factor, and that we will talk about later. On this slide now, I want to talk about the inverter loading ratio, which is the simple ratio between the capacity in DC terms, measured by us by nameplate capacity of modules, and the nameplate capacity of the inverter in AC terms. And as the module prices have fallen faster than inverter prices, developers found it advantageous to oversize their DC array capacity relative to the capacity of the inverter in order to enhance revenue, as peak generation really just occurs over a few times throughout the years, and that kind of clipping is doesn't weigh in as much in comparison to the general boost of generation that you can have for most of the year. We see an increasing upward trend of this inverter loading ratio over the years, from about 1.2 in the early years to 1.3 in 2013. In 2014, we see a slight decline that is in conjunction with our very large projects coming online that have been in development for multiple years and thus may represent more design practices as they were more common a couple of years back. And so that definitely influences our stats here. But when we look at the median inverter loading ratio that represents more the typical PV project, we see that the ILR there actually stays the same at 1.29 for both 2013 and 2014. All other things equal, in general, fixed tilt projects have a higher inverter loading ratio than tracking projects because they can benefit a little bit more from this oversizing of their DC arrays as they lack a tracking technology. And again, just with the global horizontal irradiance, all else equal, a higher ILR should mean more generation, should mean a higher net capacity factor if measured in AC terms. And with that, I want to conclude now the introduction of our overall project population and turn towards prices. Our pricing sample is slightly smaller in project numbers. We now have 55 projects for 2014. However, in capacity terms, we nearly maintain complete coverage. What you can see here is that prices have quite a bit of a distribution and are a little dispersed throughout all the years, but in general, prices have come down fairly steadily. Since the beginning years 2007 till 2009, prices have nearly halved to now $3 per watt AC or $2.3 per watt DC. A little word on this AC versus DC convention here. For most residential and commercial PV installations, dollar per watt peak or watt DC are usually used. We find that for the utility scale sector, watt AC is more meaningful, and we'll use that for the remainder of this presentation as our convention. But as the AC capacity is smaller than the DC capacity, our prices seem to be slightly higher than stats that you may be more familiar from other sources that use DC terms. Another interesting fact here is that for most of the years, the capacity-weighted average price has been lower than the median price, except in 2014, again feeling the big influx of our very large projects that have maybe had PPA negotiation environments that reached a few more years back, or had designing and EPC contracts that also reflected a higher price environment, and others a little higher here than our median price. When we look at the cheapest project, the cheapest 20th percentile, we see that prices there have fallen even starker more strongly from $3.2 per watt AC in 2013 to $2.3 per watt AC in 2014. Just to reiterate here again, this sample is backward looking, and this does not reflecting any prices of projects that have been built in 2015 or 2016. On this slide, we now look a little bit more at prices by project configuration, differentiating crystalline silicon and thin film, and tracking and fixed tilt arrays. And one thing that really pops out here is that the prices of the various technologies has really converged over the years, and that is primarily attributable to the decline in the crystalline silicon prices, which used to be much more expensive than thin film in the early years and are now on par, if not below, in 2014. We have as well here two concentrated PV prices for the year 2011 and 2012 that are very much in line with the rest of our project population. And just to confirm, these prices here again are indexed by the year of commercial operation and not of project construction, beginning of project construction. This slide now looks a little bit more at projects that have been finalized in the year 2014 and looks at how prices differ by project size. And we don't really see a clear evidence of economies of scale within the utility scale sector. And that may be due to the more modular or scalable power block design used by many developers or manufacturers that may have already wrung out most of the cost savings in comparison to commercial or residential installations. And so within one utility scale project, there's just not as much of additional saving achievable if you really scale up beyond those initial power blocks. To be fair though, some of these larger projects have been in construction for multiple years and as said earlier, maybe more expensive because of that. In general though, some of these very large projects may just face greater development hurdles or regulatory scrutiny or higher interconnections costs that may outweigh any kinds of economies of scale. In addition to the project level prices, this year for the first time in our series we were able to get some pretty detailed cost data on individual cost components with over 60 different cost categories. And we were able to construct a bottom-up model of our empirical project prices and compare that to some other models from other institutions such as the National Renewable Energy Lab, Bloomberg New Energy Finance, or Green Tech Media. And the prices here are in watt DC and not in watt AC as on the previous slides in order to facilitate the comparison. In general, our project came online in 2014 with 25 megawatts large and had in DC terms and had a single axis tracking project and was crystalline silicon. More information about this project and the individual cost categories are available in our report where we have a little bit more of a detailed discussion of that project. The prices of this project were very much in line with the other projects of a similar size in the desert southwest in our project sample. And so we thought it was apt to compare it here to other estimates. Our project prices here are a little higher than those other estimates, although there's quite a bit of variation within the different cost categories of these other modeling efforts, even though our module costs were actually quite low with $0.66 a watt. The strongest difference seems to stem from the engineering, procurement, and construction, and maybe that is reflecting a difference between more forward-looking modeling results and our backward-looking empirical data. I will now turn briefly to concentrated solar power or solar thermal projects. In contrast to PV that has really seen a declining prices over the last years, CSP prices have moved a little bit more sideways, but our data sample is quite small. Here we only have 6 projects, so it's a little bit more difficult to really piece out some statistical trends. And to be fair, these projects are relatively large, which means that they've been under construction for a long time period, meaning that they reflect maybe more design and cost environments a couple of years back. And they use rather new technology that may just have some teething problems, and that comes in at a higher price. But prices in terms of capital costs here are much higher than PV, coming in at $5 to $6.50 per watt. With that, I would like to conclude the pricing section and now talk briefly about operation and maintenance costs. We are only able to present here data from investor-owned utilities that are PV project owners and don't have any access to data from independent power producers, because those investor-owned utilities usually have to file FERC Form 1 data on their operation and maintenance costs. Because of that, our project sample is unfortunately very small, and we decided to present this year the operation and maintenance costs on a utility-wide average and not on an individual project average. Overall, prices have come down for operation and maintenance, with costs associated with that. In dollars per kilowatt year terms, prices have now fallen to $17 a kilowatt or $8 a megawatt hour. However, this most recent decline in 2014 may be attributable to a lack of reliable data from PG&E that used to be a little bit more on the higher side in the previous years. In addition to those PV O&M costs, we also have O&M costs on capacity terms for a concentrated solar power project in Florida that had much higher O&M costs. And with that, I would like to hand it over now to Marek, who is going to present more on net capacity factors and PPA prices.
Okay, thank you, Yo. Before I jump back in, I just want to pause for a minute and remind everybody to please type in your questions via the chat function. Some of you have, and I've been able to respond to a few questions, but it would be good to have more coming in so that we have something to talk about during the Q&A portion of the webinar. So what I want to do now is talk a little bit about how these projects have performed, and I'll do that in terms of capacity factor. For those of you not familiar with what a capacity factor is, it's simply the ratio of the total amount of energy generated by a project over the course of a year relative to the total potential amount of energy that that same project could have generated if operating at full capacity round the clock 24/7 for 365 days a year. So it's simply a ratio expressed here as a percentage. And what this graph shows is cumulative capacity factors from a sample of 128 PV projects displaying about 3.2 gigawatts of capacity that were built between 2007 and 2013. So note that we don't have any 2014 projects in here because we do need a full year of operating history in order to calculate a capacity factor. So across this 3.2 gigawatt sample, the average capacity factor was 27.5%, and again, that is expressed in AC terms. But you can see that there is quite a bit of individual project level variation around that mean, with individual projects ranging from 15% all the way up to 35%. You can also see that there's, or that quite a bit of this variation can be explained by at least 3 of the 4 variables that we break out in this graph, including the strength of the solar resource, whether or not the project uses tracking, each project's inverter loading ratio, and then finally the type of modules used by each project. And what we find is that in general, the projects that are in the strongest solar resource bin over here on the right, on average have capacity factors that are about 8% higher on an absolute basis than their counterparts in the lowest solar resource bin over here on the left. Similarly, tracking projects generally on average have roughly 4% higher capacity factors, again in absolute terms, than their fixed tilt counterparts, and that's true really across all 3 of these solar resource bins. And then finally, the inverter loading ratio can also boost capacity factor. We find roughly a 4% difference on average between the highest and lowest inverter loading ratio bins in each case here. We don't really see too much difference between too much difference in capacity factor based on module type, though one trend I'll point out here is the prevalence of fixed tilt thin film projects in the largest resource, in the highest solar resource bin, and also the prevalence of tracking CSI projects here. Again, as Joe mentioned, we do expect this pattern to change going forward, as we have seen a number of tracking thin film projects come online in 2014. The final thing I want to do is just call your attention to these two green stars here in the second to last bar to the right. These show where the two CPV projects in our sample would have fallen, were they included here. You can see that these CPV projects appear to be underperforming a bit relative to similarly situated PV projects, and that's particularly true when you consider that the CPV projects use dual axis tracking, whereas all of the tracking PV projects in this sample use single axis tracking. Okay. Earlier, Yo demonstrated that more recent project vintages have, on average, been sited in higher quality resource areas, and also that the average inverter loading ratio had increased among project vintages as well. And here you can see the impact of that on capacity factor by project vintage. The upward trend here is pretty obvious, and was driven in 2011 by a greater prevalence of projects using tracking, and then the additional increases in 2012 and 2013 were driven primarily by higher inverter loading ratios and also higher quality sites in terms of the solar resource. Okay, here we see capacity factors for a sample of CSP projects, some of which are very old, dating back to the late 1980s, and then also 3 which are pretty much brand new and first entered the sample in 2014. The older projects, as you can see, have been kind of chugging along at the same range of capacity factors for the past 15 years or so. Nevada Solar 1, which was built in 2007, so it's a more recent project. It's shown here by the dashed line. It is at the top of this range of older trough projects. Among the newest projects, really only one of them, Genesis, which is a 250 megawatt trough project without storage. That's the only project of these 3 that has really matched its performance expectations in 2014. Solana, which is another 250 megawatt trough project but with 6 hours of storage, anticipates a long-term capacity factor of around 41%, but in 2014 turned in roughly 28% capacity factor. Similarly, Ivanpah, which is a 377 megawatt power tower project without storage, expects a long-term capacity factor of around 27%, but in 2014 turned in about around 12 to 13%. Now, both of these projects have come out and publicly stated that it will take them several years to ramp up to full production and get these plants totally dialed in. In fact, in the case of Ivanpah, that process could take as long as 4 years. Now, we have seen the performance of both of these projects improve during the first 6 months of 2015, but seemingly not at a rate that would get them all the way up to their long-term performance goals during the full calendar year of 2015. So this is something that we'll keep an eye on going forward in future editions of this report. Okay, so let's turn now to power purchase agreement, or PPA, prices. In combination, the reduction in installed project prices that Yo showed you earlier, along with the general improvement in capacity factors that I just showed you, have kind of combined to drive levelized PPA prices lower by about 2/3 since 2009 to around $50 per megawatt hour on average. The bubble graph up top here shows levelized PPA prices by project size, which corresponds to the size of each bubble, also by technology type, and by PPA execution date across the x-axis. The bottom graph presents the same exact data but in a slightly different way, focusing on the generation weighted average price within each PPA vintage. And in both cases here, I just want to emphasize that I am reporting PPA prices in real rather than nominal dollar terms. And we do that because we are interested in time trends, and in order to tease out those time trends, one needs to remove the confounding effects of inflation. One implication of looking at PPA prices in real rather than nominal terms, however, is that the pricing will be a little bit lower. So in other words, real dollar prices on a levelized basis are lower than nominal dollar prices. So just keep that in mind as you look at that, as you look at these two graphs, that we are reporting them both in real dollars. So the downward trend here is pretty evident. It's been remarkably steady over time. It has flattened out a little bit in recent years, which is understandable given how low the pricing has dropped recently. The smaller projects, which are indicated by the smaller bubbles in the top graph, do not appear to be any less competitive than their larger counterparts. There are a few CPV and CSP projects in the sample. You can see them here up top. And back when these contracts were signed in 2009 to 2011, these contracts were still largely competitive with PV at that time. Unfortunately, we don't have any more recent visibility into this comparison, and I think that's just indicative of the fact that the the market has shifted almost entirely towards PV in recent years. Most of the sample here is operational, but some of the newer contracts are for projects that will be built next year and also this year, later this year as well. And then the final thing I want to note is that we have noticed a sort of geographic broadening of the market in recent years. So among the 12 contracts in our sample that were signed in 2015, 3 of those are actually located outside of the Southwest. And furthermore, in states that really haven't seen much, if any, utility-scale solar development to date. And I'm referring specifically to Arkansas, Alabama, and I guess to a lesser extent Florida. Okay, sticking with PPA prices, roughly 70% of our sample features contracts that have flat pricing in nominal dollar terms over the full term of the contract. And this, of course, means that these PPA prices actually decline over time in real dollar terms. And that's what's shown by the top graph here. Each of these individual lines represents a different PPA vintage. And you can see that not only do the prices step down over time across vintages, but also within each individual vintage, you can see how the prices decline over time in real dollar terms. And these declining prices stand in contrast to other forms of generation, such as gas-fired generation. So what I've done on the bottom graph here is I pulled out the 2 most recent PPA price vintages. So in other words, these are the 2 bottom lines from the top graph. And I'm plotting them here on the bottom graph along with a range of fuel cost projections from gas-fired generation. And this range is pulled from the Energy Information Administration's Annual Energy Outlook 2015 publication. And what you see here, particularly if you focus on the green line, which represents the 2015 vintage, is that PV prices start out a little bit higher than the fuel costs of gas-fired generation right now, but as they decline over time, and as the fuel cost projection increases, you eventually get to a point where the PV prices fall below the reference case gas price projection, and the gap widens over time, and then the PV prices fall outside of the range altogether by the mid-2030s. And if you were actually to levelize these 2 lines, the reference case line and then the green PPA line, you would find that the levelized solar PPA price is a little bit lower than the reference case fuel cost projection. So, even though this is obviously a very high-level comparison, I think what it shows is that PV can potentially compete with even just the fuel costs of existing gas-fired generators, not even taking into account any sort of fixed capital cost recovery. Moreover, the fact that these PPA prices have been contractually locked in, whereas the gas price projections are obviously rather uncertain, and that uncertainty increases over time. These 2 things together mean that PV can also provide a bit of a long-term hedge against possibly rising fuel costs in the future. Okay, so even though our recent PPA price sample is not super large, as I mentioned earlier, we only have 12 contracts that have been signed so far in 2015. There does appear to be a rather deep market at these low PPA prices, and that is evidenced by the strong response that a number of utilities have recently seen to their most recent solar energy or renewable energy solicitations. So the first three utilities listed here are all in the Southwest, and all three have reported heavily oversubscribed solicitations for solar or renewable energy, with much of the losing capacity, if you will, priced very similarly to the winning capacity. And it's not just the Southwest. We've also seen states like Idaho, where utilities are being inundated or have been inundated with many requests for avoided cost PURPA contracts that are priced in the range of $50 to $70 per megawatt hour. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, we've also seen the market expand across the South with competitively priced PPAs in states like Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, and Florida as well. These low prices are also supported by financial modeling. For example, if I plug in aggressive but achievable empirical data that's pulled from earlier in this slide deck, so for example, $2 per watt AC CapEx along with a 33% capacity factor, if I plug those types of assumptions along with some basic finance assumptions into a financial pro forma model, I end up with a real levelized PPA price of around $43.50 per megawatt hour. This price level is consistent with the empirical data sample that I just showed you, and sort of suggests that this pricing may in fact be somewhat rational and is not merely indicative of a race to the bottom to sign contracts and get projects built in advance of the 2017 ITC reversion. This modeling can also suggest what might happen post-2016. For example, if the 30% ITC does revert to 10% as scheduled in 2017, this very same project that I was just discussing would then need a PPA price of around $54 per megawatt hour, all else being equal. So it's roughly an $11 per megawatt hour boost or increase, which of course is significant, but on the other hand, $54 solar is still not that bad. If we think back a year or so ago, I think many of us would have been pleasantly surprised to hear about $54 solar under even a 30% ITC, let alone a 10% ITC. Moreover, some of the gap can be closed or overcome through ongoing improvements in cost and performance. For example, to get all the way back to a 4350 number under a 10% ITC through CapEx reductions alone, installed costs would need to drop by about 50 cents per watt AC to around $1.50 per watt. Now clearly a 50 cent per watt CapEx reduction is significant, particularly when you're starting at around $2 per watt. But on the other hand, based on some recent financing announcements that we've seen, some projects being built this year and next may already be at or close to that level. Moreover, First Solar's CEO over the summer somewhat famously promised that their fully installed costs would be below $1 per watt by 2017. Now, I have a feeling he was thinking more in DC rather than AC terms, but even so, $1 per watt DC equates to $1.50 per watt AC or less. So for these reasons, I think that despite the setback that could occur come 2017, I think the long-term outlook for this sector is still pretty bright. And that notion is also supported by the fact that at the end of 2014, there were nearly 45 gigawatts of solar making their way through 35 different interconnection queues across the country. That's obviously a whole lot of capacity. It was more than 5 times the installed base at the time, which puts solar in third place within the queues behind natural gas and wind power, as shown here in the inset graph. I think that probably the more interesting or more important message here, though, is where this capacity is located, which is shown by the main graph here. California and the Southwest have typically dominated this sector, but if you focus on the blue bars, which shows the amount of capacity that first entered the queues in 2014, you can see that Texas and the Southeast actually led the nation by that metric. And moreover, these 3 other regions here out to the right, the Central, Northeast, and Northwest regions, virtually all of the solar capacity in the queues at the end of 2014 in those three regions had first entered the queues in that year. And I think that's just another sign of an expanding market. Now clearly, not all of this capacity will be built. Some portion of it will fall by the wayside for one reason or another. But that said, I think it's safe to say that much of the capacity that is able to proceed towards construction will be trying to come online, if at all possible, before the end of 2016 to capture the 30% credit. So I think by all accounts we're in for a frenzied pace of construction over the next 15 months, and we here at LBNL look forward to continuing to monitor the market over that period and continuing to share the data that we gather and our findings with all of you through future editions of this report. So with that, let me conclude here by thanking the U.S. Department of Energy Sunshine Initiative for funding this work. I've also provided a web link here where you can download not only the full report but also a copy of the slide deck, as well as an Excel workbook that contains much of the data behind the graphics that we showed you today. And there's also some email addresses here for both me and Yo where you can reach us if you have any follow-up questions. But for now, I think we should move into the Q&A portion here, and I think Yo is going to kick us off, given that he's had some time to actually monitor the flow of what's coming in. So Yo, why don't you take it away?
Thank you very much, Mark. Great presentation there. So we've got a couple of questions, but please, if you do have any further questions, feel free to enter them into the chat box, and we will try to address them if time permits. So one question came and asked us whether we had any sense about data from other projects overseas, or whether we heard any general impressions from other colleagues. And in terms of operation and maintenance cost, or later on capacity factors, that clearly, well, the capacity factors will clearly differ depending on the solar resources. Regarding the cost, I know anecdotally from Germany that utility scale prices are supposed to be around €1 a watt or so, but that is in DC terms and not AC terms. I'm not sure what their typical inverter loading ratio there might be, so that in dollar terms that may be around $1.50 a watt AC or so. And just recently I saw for current British policy reevaluations, they assume around $1.50 per watt DC. So depending on the inverter loading ratio practices in Britain, that may be close to $2 watt AC. I'm not very familiar with data from India or China. I think it is important to keep in mind that not that many other countries really have such developed utility-scale solar markets, or at least utility-scale solar installations of a similar size, that much bigger than 5 megawatts AC, in comparison to the United States. That may be a little bit difficult to get good data there. So that was one question. Another question was about a typical range of the inverter loading ratio if it was sized for DC capacity value. And most of the projects that we've seen so far really do size with some clipping in mind, but we have seen some installations using inverters that go that basically match the DC size. So that's a 1-to-1 ratio. A few projects have maybe 1.05 or 1.1, but most of them really do seem to take into account some kind of clipping. I think that's maybe it for me for the moment. I don't know, Mark, whether you want to take some.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I see a few here I can take. So there's one asking whether panel degradation has been taken into account for capacity factors among the older solar projects, and the answer is yes. To calculate capacity factors, we are pulling in net generation data. So we're actually pulling in the megawatt hour numbers, and we are in all cases dividing those by the original capacity of the project. So any sort of module degradation that occurs is already reflected in those megawatt hour numbers. I guess the second one that I can take here is someone was wondering, I guess I mentioned that roughly 75% of the projects in our PPA sample were operational, and someone was wondering what percentage were canceled. And just to clarify, excuse me, all of the projects shown in those graphs are either operational or soon will be, to the best of our knowledge. We have not included any projects that were subsequently canceled. Let's see, Yo, do you have any others lined up here?
Yeah, one question asked us whether or not ITC is included in the PPA prices that you presented, and the answer is yes. Of course, these PPA prices are post-incentives, so they do take into account the ITC and other accelerated depreciation practices. And one question asked whether I could speak a little bit more about how the CAGTM methodology leads to differences in installed cost compared to the data that we present here. And it is a little bit difficult to say that. In general, the publicly available GTM data had fairly broad categories. For example, they combined the inverters and the AC subsystem, and that is in our category here subsumed under inverters. And it was a little bit unclear to us to what extent they include insurance prices or other land costs, etc., in their category, which they call supply chain overhead and margin. So what exactly is included in overhead? Same goes with certain finance costs or other less tangible soft costs. For more information about what exactly we include in our project, please go to our publication where we have that parsed out a little bit more clearly.
Okay, and I've got a few more now lined up here. Someone asked, or someone stated that the solar resource is great in West Texas, but there are very few projects compared to Arizona, New Mexico, and California, and this person is wondering why that is. I think there are a couple of reasons. One, that the Texas market is heavily natural gas based, and because gas prices are so low at the moment, wholesale power prices have been quite low in Texas, which makes it harder for solar to compete. At the same time, the Texas electricity market is pretty heavily deregulated, which means that you don't have a whole lot of utilities out there looking to sign long-term contracts. And so that's made it a little bit more difficult for solar to break into the Texas market, although it is starting to happen now. Another question here was wondering how many of the projects in our sample sell power on day-ahead markets versus through long-term PPAs. So the question, I guess, is really asking how many merchant projects are there in our sample. And I think the answer is probably really just one at this point. There's a project in Texas that was built sort of on a quasi-merchant basis, although I believe it's now starting to kind of break off pieces of capacity and sell them through short-term contracts to various end users. So really, merchant solar hasn't happened to any great extent yet, and almost all of the projects that are operational are selling through long-term PPAs. One other question here. Someone is wondering what efficiency is assumed for converting the natural gas price projections into power terms, dollar per megawatt hour terms. So what I did there is I actually used the heat rates that were implied by the Energy Information Administration modeling, and it's a curve. It starts out around, I think, around 8,000 BTUs per kilowatt hour and declines over time, ending up in 2040 at somewhere around 7,000 BTUs per kilowatt hour. Yo, do you have any others lined up, or should I keep going?
Maybe I can intersect here with one question that was asking to explain the difference between DC and AC capacity. And so in general, for our electricity system, most of the electricity that is flowing through wires in the transmission system are running on AC current and not DC current, and so it needs to be converted. And for that, we have the inverter that transforms DC electricity into AC electricity. There are some slight efficiency penalties in that context. But more importantly, as we spoke earlier, there are different sizing practices. You can choose the size of your inverter, how much incoming DC current or electricity this inverter can accept and transfer into AC electricity. And so the practices are just such that this inverter is usually not scaled to 100% of the DC capacity size, mostly due to cost factors. Those inverters do add quite a bit of cost. And so because one does not always get 100% of DC electricity coming in, people have chosen to have the inverters at a slightly smaller size. And I hope that explains the difference here between DC and AC capacity.
Okay, I've got a few more. Someone was asking whether we consider revenue from SRECs or solar renewable energy credits. Yeah, so I should have been clear about this. All of the PPAs in our sample are what are known as bundled PPAs, so they include not only the energy value but also capacity value and REC value as well. If we come across a project that has stripped out its RECs and is selling them separately, we will exclude that project from our sample, in large part because really what we're trying to do here is capture sort of the total amount of revenue that a project needs to be viable. And for the most part, we don't have a whole lot of visibility into SREC pricing. And so in cases where the PPA is not fully bundled, we just don't even include that project in our sample. Another one, someone was asking whether we see trends in time of delivery pricing. So just as a quick refresher here, some utilities will include what are known as time of delivery values in their contracts, where power that's generated during a certain time of the day will be priced more favorably than power that's delivered at other times. And in general, these time of delivery periods line up with the load profile of these utilities. What we've seen is that it's primarily the California utilities that use time of delivery pricing. We do see it on occasion outside of California, but for the most part, it's California projects. So hopefully that answers that question. Yo, do you have any others to jump in with?
One easily answerable question that popped up was whether or not we excluded or subtracted ITC from any cost element in the bottom-up cost modeling exercise. And no, those prices presented there, as well as all the prices that refer to the project prices in the whole price section, do not subtract the ITC in any way. They are all pre-incentive full project costs.
Okay, someone's asking about CSP, so we should probably take that one since we haven't had many CSP questions here. Someone's wondering if we could comment on the primary potential reasons why a CSP project might underperform. Let me preface this by saying that I'm not a CSP expert, but in general, if you think about, for example, a power tower project, you've got thousands of heliostats that need to be focused, concentrated on the solar collector at the top of the tower. There's no doubt a lot of bugs that need to be worked out of that sort of system. You're also dealing with a working fluid in this case, whereas with PV it's more of a solid state technology. And then there have been some avian issues as well at some of these projects where projects may have gone into standby mode at certain times or been taken offline over avian concerns. So I think there's probably several different reasons why it's taking a while for some of these CSP projects to come up to full speed. Yo, do you have anything yet?
No, I think most of the few remaining questions that pertain to PPAs.
Okay, yeah, so I see one here now. Someone's asking about basically corporate PPAs, so contracts that are signed with corporate off-takers, and they're wondering whether we've seen a pickup in that as the price of utility solar has fallen. Yes, we definitely have. There have been a number of pretty high-profile announcements. They seem to be, increasing in frequency, and that's certainly an exciting new market, not only for solar but also for wind power. It seems to be a a growing trend. Let me just look through some of these other ones here. Someone's asking whether we've seen any correlation of, I guess, number of projects versus states that have net metering. So just to clarify, so we're focusing really on projects, for the most part, that are not net metered. These are projects that are selling power through wholesale contracts to utilities or other types of off-takers. So net metering really doesn't enter into it to any great extent. If there would be any correlation, it might just be general familiarity with solar and probably that sort of thing. I don't really see much reason that there would be any kind of direct influence there. Someone's asking about whether there's a meaningful delta, so difference between PPAs signed in the southeast versus southwest. I presume the focus is on pricing here. I guess it depends on the definition of meaningful. The lowest price PPAs in our sample are definitely in the southwest, where the resource is strongest and where a few of the states have incentives for utility scale solar. So for example, New Mexico has a 10-year state level production incentive, production tax credit for solar. And that helps to push prices down. So the lowest prices are definitely in the southwest, but that said, we have seen some prices across the south. I think as I put up there on one slide, there's a project in Alabama that will be selling into Tennessee, I believe, at a price of $61. Some of the PPAs that have been announced, sort of, in Georgia are presumably down around the $60 level. There's one in Arkansas, priced somewhere around $50. So we're not really seeing the $40 prices yet, or at least we're not, given our limited visibility. But I would say that they're not too far out of the ballpark.
One quick question pertains here to whether or not we see any kinds of economies of scale in the announced PPAs for those PPAs with 2015 vintage, and Mark, you're more familiar with that data, but looking at the graph, it seems that overall even smaller projects are capable of hitting the $50 a megawatt threshold now in 2015. I guess ideally one would do a little bit more of a detailed analysis here with regressions or others in order to pass out other influencing factors beyond the size of a project alone, but there don't seem to be huge outliers depending on size.
Okay, and it looks like we have time probably for one more question. There's one here asking whether utility scale PV projects ever face curtailment, and if so, is that accounted for in the capacity factor analysis? Utility scale PV projects definitely could face curtailment, and if the installed capacity base keeps growing in places like California, there is very real concerns that curtailment could be a growing issue looking ahead. To my knowledge, we haven't seen a whole lot of curtailment to date of solar projects, in part because they're generally generating power when the utility needs it most, and we haven't quite gotten to those deep penetration levels where over-generation is a problem. If there was curtailment and we weren't aware of it, that would be reflected in the capacity factor analysis, because again, we are simply pulling the net megawatt hours that are generated by each project. And so if that project is curtailed for some reason, then that will flow through a smaller number of megawatt hours that we pick up. So with that, we are now at the top of the hour here, so I think we should wrap it up. So I just want to thank everybody for tuning in today, and we hope you found it informative. This webinar has been recorded, and we will try to get it up on our website within a few days here. So thank you very much, everybody, and thank you, Yo, for joining me.
Thank you very much to all of you.
Okay. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.